guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Yeah, not a thing or two, but about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, our topic for this episode stems from the recent IPO for SpaceX a few weeks ago, which the headline from that event was that it made Elon Musk the world's first trillionaire. And I believe the share price has fallen since then, and he may not technically be a trillionaire anymore, but that's neither here nor there, because what it triggered in me was a discussion that's been going on in liberal circles, at least for a while, which is, should billionaires even exist?
Yeah.
So that's the question I put to you, and I added a little addendum of explain why or why not.
Okay.
So take it away. I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about this.
Okay. Well, as always, thank you for the question. I assume that in asking that question, you believed the answer to be no, and I suspect that the majority of our listeners feel the same. That's where I began as well. Just a month or so ago, as layoffs were hitting Meta's Seattle office hard, Mark Zuckerberg's mega yacht was docked a short distance away in Lake Union for repairs. You could not ask for a more stark depiction of inequality in our society, and it's easy to get angry about that sort of thing. And believe me, those things do make me angry. But a single word answer to your question, no, would have produced the shortest podcast on record. So instead, I thought it would be more interesting to seriously entertain the question and to invite in philosophers who, in one fashion or another, answered that question with a yes. Though, as we'll see, the devil is often in the details. So imagine that we're in a courtroom right now and that the existence of billionaires is on trial. The defense will be calling in a series of expert witnesses who will lay out their arguments for why your answer can logically be answered with a yes. You and I, meanwhile, are sitting in the jury box. And when the testimony is complete, we'll deliberate and reach our decisions.
And just to make sure I understand this, representing the prosecution is your presumption of our existing bias that the answer is no. Does that serve as the prosecution?
Yeah. Well, if the existence of billionaires is on trial, then by definition, the prosecution is in charge of arguing no. But yeah, the premise here is that that you and I are probably starting with a certain perspective. And so we're going to hear the opposite perspective phrased as best it can be done.
Okay.
But before I bring in the witnesses, let me be clear about the question on the table because it has a way of spreading out. The question we'll begin with in this episode is not whether specific individual billionaires are morally good and ethical people. We are not asking whether the massive personal fortune of any billionaire in particular was earned cleanly without causing suffering somewhere else in the world. And we are certainly not going to ask whether post-industrial capitalism is a just system. If we do want to ask that question, it would probably need more than one episode all to itself. Those questions are all important, but we're going to begin with something else. The question on the table right now is much narrower. Is there any rational argument, any principled argument, for permitting a human being to become that rich? There was a time not that long ago when being a millionaire really meant something. Then the very top of the 1% became billionaires, and now with Elon Musk, as you mentioned, the world has or had, for a brief time, its very first trillionaire, at least on paper. In a just society, should anyone ever be that wealthy? That's the question we will seek to answer first, and then we can turn to the objections. So let's get on to the testimony. The defense attorney stands and says, Your Honor, the defense would like to call its first witness, Adam Smith. Joe, you probably remember Adam Smith from the Common Core classes we both took in college.
Yes.
He was an 18th century Scottish moral philosopher, best known today for his Wealth of Nations, but before that he wrote on sympathy and conscience. He's remembered as the patron saint of the free market, which, if we brought him back from the dead, would probably come as a surprise to him because he distrusted merchants and was openly suspicious of the rich. But he's been called today as an expert witness in defense of billionaires and trillionaires, and here's the case that he would make. Smith's focus was on labor. He wrote, quote, "The property which every man has in his own labor, as it is the original foundation of all other property, so it is the most sacred and inviolable." That is to say, you own yourself, so you own what you make, and you own what you can trade it for. And when people are left free to pursue their own interest, Smith believed that something remarkable happens. Here's his famous line, quote, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest," unquote. A baker feeds you not because he loves you, but because he wants your money. And Smith believed firmly that this arrangement works better than love would. The individual, Smith says, quote, "is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it," unquote. So if Smith were to defend a very large personal fortune, it would be on the basis that it's the residue of all that useful good. An intentional good, sure, but good nonetheless. The person who organizes capital on a vast scale and in the process drives down the cost of the things ordinary people need in pursuit of greater sales volume has served the public precisely by serving himself. In theory, at least, Smith believed the working poor of a commercial society might live better than the lords of poorer ones. A great fortune is a symptom of a system that lifts everyone.
Okay.
Now, you might think this is a pretty naive way of looking at things, but Smith is way ahead of you. His argument came with conditions. He had nothing but contempt for men who got rich by rigging the game instead of winning it fair and square. And he wrote a sentence that's almost certainly going to echo in our discussion later, quote, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable," unquote. In short, Smith did defend wealth, but only wealth that was honestly gained and that lent itself to a society that was prosperous. And led itself to a society that was prosperous for more than just the few wealthy within it. So if Smith defends the fortune by its unintended consequences, the second witness called by the defense throws consequences out the window entirely. Robert Nozick was a 20th century American philosopher who taught at Harvard. And in 1974, he wrote a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia that was part of an ongoing quarrel with a colleague down the hall, John Rawls, who we'll be meeting later in this episode. Nozick was a libertarian, and his argument is simple to the point of being a little blunt. Quote, "Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights," unquote. Justice for Nozick is a series of steps that you can track. He said, quote, "Whatever arises from a just situation by just steps is itself just. If you came by your first dollar honestly, and every trade after that was voluntary and above board, then whatever total you arrive at in the end, no matter how big it might be, is yours, and no one gets to confiscate it simply because they happen to believe that the number has too many zeros." He offered a famous illustration. Imagine we could wave a wand and distribute all the wealth in America equally. Perfect equality all at once. Right away, a large number of people decide, of their own free will, to pay a few dollars to watch one extraordinary singer perform. Let's say it's Taylor Swift. By that evening, Taylor Swift is a millionaire, and the society is no longer perfectly equal, and yet no one was robbed. Every transfer was a choice. To maintain equality in society, you'd have to police transactions forever, and the greater the equality you're aiming for, the more society would need to interfere with the lives of its citizens. Or, as Nozick puts it, quote, "No end-state principle or distributional patterned principle of justice can be continually realized without continuous interference with people's lives," unquote. And taxing away the results, he insists, isn't so different from seizing the labor itself. Quote, "Taxation of earnings from labor is on a par with forced labor," unquote. Now, I don't want to get distracted here by the merits or lack thereof of libertarian philosophy. What I do want is to focus on the question that Nozick put on the table. If the process of wealth accumulation was fair at every step, At what dollar amount does a fortune become illegitimate? 10 million, 100 million, a billion? What moral principle is it that tells us what the number should be? If you have trouble naming that number, he'd say that your objection isn't philosophical, it's merely aesthetic. And yet Nozick, even though he was a libertarian, was honest enough to admit that the history of wealth does not present a clean ledger. The actual record of who owns what, he conceded, is, quote, shot through with injustices, unquote. Conquest, slavery, fraud, monopoly, and plunder. And he borrowed a proviso from John Locke. An acquisition is only just if it leaves, quote, enough and as good, unquote, for others. So similar in some respects to Adam Smith.
Okay, I'm taking notes.
So that was our second witness.
Yep.
The third witness is Friedrich Hayek, who was an Austrian-British Nobel Prize-winning economist, and a great theme of his work was human ignorance. Quote, the case for individual freedom rests chiefly on the recognition of the inevitable ignorance of all of us concerning a great many of the factors on which the achievement of our ends and welfare depends, unquote. Here's the idea. The knowledge a society runs on, who needs what, where, how badly, and at what price, is not sitting in any one particular person's head. It's scattered across millions of people, and most of it is never spoken aloud. Hayek saw the market as the machinery that pulls all that scattered knowledge together through prices. And when someone makes a whole lot of money, it's often just a very loud price signal. This person or this company found something the rest of us wanted but didn't know how to get otherwise. Crucially, Hayek severs reward from merit. He's not saying the billionaire is a good person or even a clever one. He wrote, quote, we must look at results, not intentions or motives, and can allow the individual to act on his own knowledge only if we also allow him to keep what his fellows are willing to pay him for his services, irrespective of whether we think this reward appropriate to the moral merit he has earned, unquote. If we think about whether billionaires or trillionaires deserve to exist, that poses a question. If we cap wealth at some figure, who will decide what the cap is? Who owns that decision? And can we be confident that some hypothetical committee drawing the line will draw it justly, and that the line they draw will produce a better world than the messy one they started with? Hayek warned against what he called, quote, conscious direction, unquote, the arrogance of believing that any of us knows enough to design a system so complex. To abolish the billionaire, he'd say, you first have to appoint someone who has nearly godlike powers of knowledge and insight, and that person does not exist. On cross-examination, though, Hayek would admit that he is every bit as frightened of concentrated power as he was of central planners. His argument for the market is most fundamentally an argument against what he called exclusive, privileged, and monopolistic organization. Whether the coercion is exerted by a bureaucrat or a tech CEO didn't much matter to him. And that brings us to the fourth witness, the American game theorist Thomas Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize and is best known for thinking about nuclear brinksmanship during the Cold War. He had a particular knack for showing how enormous social patterns emerge in often unexpected ways from small, ordinary individual choices. One of his books is called Micromotives and Macro Behavior, and the subtitle gives away the ending. Quote, aggregate patterns do not straightforwardly reveal individual motives, unquote. Let's apply that idea to a modern fortune. When you see an individual human being whose net worth rivals that of most of the world's countries, it's easy to imagine some sinister design, a deliberate and long-term strategy of piling up wealth like some sort of dragon hoarding gold in a cave. Schelling would say to look closer. Instead of an evil plot or an evil person twirling his mustache, there are a few billion people independently making choices. The search engine they use, the phone they buy, the car they drive. They make these choices for their own private reasons, none of them intending to enrich anybody. The massive personal fortune is simply an outcome of the patterns that emerge within these choices. And modern technology amplifies the pattern. Once you've designed the software, adding additional customers costs you next to nothing, so small advantages in quality snowball into enormous and enormously profitable differences. Schelling would add the possibility of such an enormous prize as doing something useful. It mobilizes talent and capital toward problems that might otherwise go unsolved. It's the world's biggest winner-take-all contest. Most people will never win it, But most people never win an Olympic medal either, and even so, thousands of athletes dedicate themselves to training and competing. And still, Schilling was no more naive than the other expert witnesses we've heard from. He drew a careful distinction, saying, quote, "How well each does for himself in adapting to a social environment is not the same thing as how satisfactory a social environment they collectively create for themselves." End quote. That is to say, a million rational individual choices can cumulatively result in a society that is collectively miserable, everyone acting sensibly in their own best interest, and the whole coming out worse than anyone wanted. Schilling called those collectively inferior outcomes and said that they are easy to spot in the real world. We've only got one more witness to go for the defense.
Okay.
And this witness is a little surprising because he's a hero of the left. John Rawls' 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, is the primary text of modern egalitarianism. You would think that a card-carrying egalitarian would reject billionaires on sight, but Rawls did not. Rawls begins with a thought experiment. Imagine that you are in charge of drawing up from scratch the rules that will govern a new society. And imagine that you do so behind what he called a veil of ignorance. You have no idea which rung in this society you personally will occupy. Rich man or poor man, privileged or disadvantaged, favored or reviled. What rules would you choose not knowing which life would become your own? Rawls thought that you would obviously choose fairness, but not perfect equality. You would choose what he called the difference principle. Permit inequalities, but only those that work to, quote, the greatest benefit of the least advantaged, unquote. If letting some people get enormously rich serves to raise the floor for the least well-off, through innovation, investment, taxation, what have you, then the person behind the veil would be okay with that bargain. An impoverished society that is equal can be worse for everyone than a rich society in which inequality is the rule. And I'd point out that this isn't a merely theoretical construct. We live in a grotesquely unequal society where the average CEO to worker pay ratio for S&P 500 companies is 285 to 1. The average worker would need several lifetimes to earn what a Fortune 500 CEO makes in a single year. But even so, most people alive today, even relatively poor people, live longer, healthier, more comfortable lives than even wealthy people did a century or more ago. The floor has in fact risen. What's more, Rawls agreed with Hayek and Nozick on one point. Nobody morally deserves their talents. What you were born with, your intelligence, your drive, your family, Rawls called the natural lottery, which from a moral point of view is completely arbitrary. In short, a billionaire has no cosmic claim to his money, but then neither do we. And neither do we have a cosmic claim to seize someone else's money, so long, Rawls would argue, as the system is lifting the people at the bottom. So even John Rawls, the champion of egalitarianism, did not condemn a massive personal fortune for being too large. Like our other witnesses, though, he attached an important condition. Rawls insisted that one thing must never be for sale, the equal worth of political liberty. Large concentrations of wealth, he warned, quote, tend to seriously undermine the value of political liberties. And for Rawls, this consideration comes first, which means that the very moment a fortune starts buying political power, Rawls stopped defending it and flipped to the prosecution. So there they are. If you came into this episode thinking, I can't imagine any possible argument in support of billionaires and trillionaires, here are 5 men who, in principle at least, disagree. They all argued that there is a path to obscene wealth that is not inherently unjust or even wrong. But still, there's something about that mega yacht floating in Lake Union while workers are losing their jobs a few blocks away that simply feels wrong to me. It offends our basic human decency, and I think it also reflects our suspicion that these fortunes were never really the achievement of a single individual in the first place. So there's one more philosopher I'd like to bring in, but he's not a witness for the defense. Instead, he's here to challenge the testimony of the others. Michael Sandel's work criticizes an image that floats in and out of the work of all 5 of the witnesses that we've heard from, that of the self-owning, self-made individual. In Sandel's terms, the unencumbered self, who arrives in the world already complete and then goes out and earns. Sandel says that image is a fiction. We are, he argues, members before we are choosers, constituted by communities, languages, institutions, and inheritances we did not build and mostly did not choose. And if that's right, then no fortune is ever really one person's doing. The roads, the schools, the courts, the centuries of accumulated science, the 3 billion strangers already plugged into the internet. Those were community achievements, and the billionaire is no more than a person who happened to be standing at the spot where all of it converged and who managed to stuff some of it into a private account. Sandel would argue that when we recoil at the absurd excesses of our corporate ruling class, it isn't envy. It's a sense that something that once belonged to everybody has now been quietly privatized. I called these 5 thinkers in as witnesses in defense of billionaires, but every one of them handed us what we need to convict not the category, but the conditions. They defended the fortune in theory and indicted it in fact. To review, Smith defends the honest tradesman and condemns the man who wins by monopoly against his countrymen, which describes much of the modern economy. Nozick defends the clean ledger and concedes that the real ledger is shot through with injustices and must leave enough and as good for others, a test that inherited fortunes and enclosed markets routinely flunk. Hayek defends dispersed knowledge and despises the privileged and monopolistic organization that concentrated wealth builds, along with the political power it almost inevitably buys. Schelling defends voluntary coordination and warns that it can settle into a collectively inferior outcome, a fair description of the world that we live in. And Rawls finally defends the inequality that lifts the poor, then places one thing permanently off the table, the fortune that buys the government. So we began by asking whether there's any rational argument for billionaires, and there is. But the arguments taken seriously equate in principle, but convict nearly every real-world example. There's probably not a billionaire out there, with the possible exception of Warren Buffett, who would pass muster with all of these philosophers. If your question had been, should Elon Musk exist, I would have had a simple answer for that. It's easy to convict the individual examples. When it comes to billionaires as a category, though, after considering all these arguments, I have to say my answer is this. I'd prefer that they not exist, or at the very least that they not park their grotesquely huge boats where I can see them. But can I say with complete confidence that we'd all be better off if wealth was capped at some arbitrary figure with some public official being in charge of choosing the number? If I'm being totally honest, I can't be sure. I find myself in the same position as the philosophers. They constructed theoretical justifications of vast wealth, but were to a man suspicious of whoever actually managed to get that rich. Meanwhile, I'm generally in favor of wiping out the idea of billionaire-scale wealth, but I'd be concerned about the unintended consequences of any specific policies governments would use to accomplish that goal. So my final answer to your question, should billionaires exist? Maybe.
Oh boy, Mark, I'm constipated with thoughts that need to come out now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Give me a minute.
I saw you furiously scribbling as I was going through these arguments, so I'm sure you have a whole lot to talk about.
Yes. So let me start here. You took this as a literal question. Should billionaires exist? Like once you get to the threshold of $1 billion, is that illegitimate? And I understand why you did that, because this is kind of a question in a vacuum, right? In the abstract. But the first thing I think of as I hear those arguments is, what if it's a rhetorical question and not a literal question? Meaning, okay, it's inefficient to have some administrator, deep state, deciding that the minute you reach $1 billion, you need to lose a certain amount of money. And as you said in one of those examples, I think the Hayek, who's smart enough to even administer that, right? But what if it was more of a rhetorical framework where there's no need for an administrative state to oversee this, but there is a general need for fairness and economic equality. And so we tailor our policies around the general concept of fairness, which is by definition at odds with the concept of billionaires, you know?
Mm-hmm. The way I approach this is that your question lives in 2 spaces at once. Is being a billionaire a signal that something is wrong, and it doesn't matter how you made the money. And then there's all the billionaires we know, most of whom are troubled figures at best, and possibly just like Peter Thiel, openly antagonistic to the majority of humanity. So the way I answered it was to try to answer both, but within separate parts of the episode, where I would explore the first and then I would answer the second. And so, to your rhetorical question, I feel like, yes, in principle, I would love to live in a society where we legislate towards a spirit of fairness. Within the world that we live in, I can't imagine that ever really working out, because I can't imagine a legislative process that just uses a fuzzy notion of what's fair with the very broad range of possible definitions of fairness. I think that you would end up needing to tie it to a single figure. I know the billionaire should not exist. Like, you would need a yes/no gating mechanism to make any sort of effective legislation. Otherwise, court challenges and all of that, you would simply have, something that looked good on paper but had no practical effect on the society.
Well, okay, so let me push back a little on that. We're living in what many people are calling the second Gilded Age, right?
Mm-hmm.
Inequality is run rampant. And for some of us, younger people in particular, it's hard to imagine a different society because the one you grew up in is so friggin' unequal to begin with. But I know that during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate was close to 90%.
Sure.
And we were living through an unparalleled era of prolific growth for all classes of society, when the CEO's salary was only 20 or 30 times that of his workers and not 285 times or whatever number you just said.
Yeah.
And that was a very prosperous time for America at the top and the bottom. So it certainly can be done. There were certainly millionaires then. There might have been billionaires then. I don't know. But we were attempting to have a fairer society, and it was working. I don't think it's impractical.
I think it's been well documented in this podcast, Joe, that you are a deeper believer in the 2026 democratic process than I am. I also am nostalgic for the days when the top tax rate was so much higher, but I can't see us ever getting back to that realistically, for two reasons. First off, money does buy political power, and a number of the philosophers we went through here waved that warning flag. They were right. If you're a billionaire, you have the ear of politicians the way like you and I do not. And those billionaires will say, do not pass this, or they'll fund your opposition in the primary, or they will fund attack ads on television. There are a number of ways for a billionaire to just take the spare change from his pocket and influence legislation. And then there's the second part of that, which is a number of places within the world have set themselves up as tax havens. And so that if, let's say, we do go back to 90%, then suddenly Elon Musk would be resident of Monaco, and he would still be living in the US and acting as CEO of all his companies. But for tax purposes, he would park the money somewhere else, just the way Microsoft today, its official headquarters are in Ireland. And that's because the corporate tax rate there is vanishingly small. And so Microsoft basically pays next to no local taxes. They have been in the state of Washington since their inception, and they don't put a single dollar into the state coffers because they claim to be a company that is headquartered in Ireland. And there's nothing illegal about that. And there are business school professors who say it is their fiduciary responsibility to do that because it keeps stockholder money from exiting the company. And yet, I personally think it's wrong, but there's no way they're going to stop doing that. And so it would just be the same scenario with personal wealth. I just don't see any way around that unless it's not just the US that institutes that policy, it's every other country too.
Right. I mean, I understand your point. As long as there's been taxation, there's been tax avoidance strategies, and that's not going to change, especially with this new generation of Gilded Age robber barons who are going to try to find every way to hide their money from the tax collector. That doesn't mean it's not worth trying to overhaul the way we do taxes, and I believe we could be the excesses of the Trump administration, the obvious Gilded Age we're living in, is going to precipitate a new progressive era in this country. That's just my personal prediction. And we'll see what kind of ways we can make things more equal and attack the rampant greed of the robber baron class. But we can put that aside. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. I made myself a list of pros and cons of having billionaires, and maybe we should just tick through my list because some of these points were covered by the philosophers, but I want to make sure we have an airing for all of them.
Sure.
Since the philosophers were witnesses for the defense, I will start with my list of cons, so the prosecution's case. And here's one I don't think I heard referenced in your presentation, that wealth accumulation is inefficient. You know, if a vanishingly small number of billionaires and now trillionaires are hoarding all this money, putting it in bank accounts and stock portfolios, that's not participating in the economy. You know, the money stays trapped in people's bank accounts. Whereas when money is free to move around, when you're giving money to people who need to spend it, there's this money multiplier effect, you know, where people spend some money, they put some in the bank takes that money, spends some of it, gives some of it to people who spend it, and the rest they put in the bank, and so on and so on and so on, so that the end effect is that $1 billion becomes $10 billion. The money multiplies in the market. It triggers more and more spending. That phenomenon vanishes when money is held by billionaires, and that's simply bad for the economy and bad for society.
Yeah, I'm not an economist, so I'm not sure I have a full perspective on that. I think you might be right, and I also think there might be a class of investment that would be off the table in the scenario that you described, where, like, consider something like founding a company, where you and I would probably not found a company because we have money, but we don't have enough money. We would not put that much money at risk because if the company fails, then we'd be left with nothing, or we'd be left carrying a huge debt. So in terms of the startup scenario, like creating something from scratch, by any measure, you and I are incredibly prosperous compared to smallholder farmers in Africa. And yet that sort of thing is beyond us. And so a certain level of wealth is necessary for at least that portion within the economy of creation of new companies and that sort of thing. But again, not being an economist, I can't quantify that.
What I come back to is the argument that you added at the end from Michael Sandel, that community achievements undergird solo achievement, individual achievement. Great fortunes are rarely due to individual effort alone.
Right.
You know, there's a huge fiscal and regulatory and financial and human infrastructure that undergirds all individual achievement in the world. People don't go from rags to riches. Very often they go from riches to more riches. That's
Sure.
certainly Donald Trump's story. And
Yeah.
I read somewhere that Elon Musk's father owned shares in an emerald mine or something. So,
Right.
And Bezos got a $1 million loan from his parents.
Yeah.
So,
What's the joke about Donald Trump, that he was born on third base and thinks he hit a triple?
right. And then I'm reminded of things that Elizabeth Warren and Barack Obama said like a dozen years ago. Obama's infamous speech, you didn't build that. that he got pilloried by Republicans when they took that sentence out of context. What he meant was that the education system that educated the individual billionaire, the roads and bridges that the billionaire uses to transport his goods,
Right.
the police and fire protection that prevent his business from being looted and burned to the ground, right? That's all paid for by us.
Yeah.
So to think that you're the rugged individualist who did it yourself is that's fantasy land,
Yeah.
And not to mention the low wages and the antipathy to labor and the corporate monopolies that allowed you to get where you were in the first place,
Sure.
taking advantage of the human infrastructure.
I've always been aggravated by the argument that CEO pay is that high because they deserve it, because they're just that important. It shows up also in my work. I read a fair number of consultant written papers about things like AI. And inevitably, they're always phrased as, this is what the C-suite needs to do. It represents this point of view that the only people who are important within a company are the CEO, the chief financial officer, the chief operational officer, the chief technology officer. If you don't have a C in front of your title, then you basically do not exist as far as consultants are concerned. And I think to some extent that's intended just to flatter the audience of the executives who would sign off on hiring these consultants. But I also think that there is a philosophy that the only important person in a company is the CEO. And so he deserves 285 times as much as the frontline guy, because you could replace that frontline guy 285 times over before you found another CEO of equal quality.
Right.
And personally, I think that's bullshit. I've always thought that's bullshit, but it is the argument that's behind the belief. That's why there's no shareholder revolt against a CEO pulling down $30 million a year, even as the stock price declines, because we're locked in this strange obsession with the idea that CEOs are just that important. And I personally think they're not nearly as important, but that's just me.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. Yeah. Do you know who Nick Hanauer is? You ever hear that name?
No, didn't come up.
He's a self-described plutocrat, but he's actually a political progressive. He was one of the early investors in Amazon. So he owns a yacht, just like all the rest of them, but he's actually a progressive. And he did a TED Talk like 10 years ago in which he basically said that if we don't stabilize inequality, they're going to come out for us plutocrats with the pitchforks, and they'll be justified in doing so. And basically, one of the arguments he made in that TED Talk is that inequality is stupid. It doesn't serve rich people to have a climate of rampant inequality. It's self-defeating. Mm-hmm. It's bad for business. The way that things are truly good for everybody is to have a thriving middle class with a lot of direct investment in lifting up the floor. Forget about the ceiling for a second. Lift the floor, and then the middle class is thriving. They're getting a living wage, and it raises the prospects for everyone because of all the money that's spent, which creates demand for products, which further enriches all the billionaires.
Yeah.
So that's the virtuous cycle that we need to get to, and I've seen this described as limitarianism, not libertarianism, limitarianism, where surplus wealth does very little to improve the quality of life of its owners, and investing money in your own workers and in the working class and the middle class generally lifts all boats, including your own. So that's kind of another way of getting at the first point I made about billionaires not existing being more of a rhetorical question. There are things we can do to limit inequality. May not eliminate all billionaires, but it'll certainly make for a better environment for everyone.
Yeah, I personally love the idea that we would deliberately invest in the middle class. It seems to run counter to most recent history when we've been plundering the middle class because the right lowers taxes on the upper classes and the left wants to lower taxes on the lower classes, and both sides go to the middle classes to make up the difference, it seems sometimes. I've been thinking a lot about the middle class lately, because the middle class has not always existed. It's a fairly recent phenomenon, the existence of the middle class. And I've been wondering, there's two ways to look at that. Either the rise of the middle class was a signal of human society exiting generational poverty and finding a better way. And then the flip side of that is that the middle class was kind of like print newspapers, where it was just something that started and then declined, and that there's nothing motivating like further development of that trend. Like it could be, it was just a historical blip. And kind of connected to this, again, with my fairly pessimistic frame, I keep going back to the Middle Ages, where there was enormous political inequality and economic equality as well. And there was enormous discontent. There were rebellions every now and then with peasants carrying, pitchforks and torches and trying to put the elite to the sword. And the way that the elite dealt with that was not by investing in the middle class. It was by using their surplus wealth to pay for a private military to protect themselves against the poor people. They built high walls and establish a monopoly on violence and created severe consequences for taking any measure that challenged the world order. And that was a system that was so successful that it lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so my hope is that, yes, the rise of the middle class is a signal that this time is different and that the future will be different. My fear is that it will just be a new Middle Ages with a new elite and a new private military and a new form of high walls keeping the poor people out. And that will just go back to the way things were hundreds of years ago. That's my fear.
Yeah, well, your fear might be well-founded. I guess all I want to say to that is some aspects of what you described as medieval society are happening right now.
Indeed.
We are putting up walls and treating our own citizens shabbily and shooting people on the street, as just happened again yesterday.
Yes.
Even in this world of inequality, this Gilded Age, we are starting to recreate some of the worst aspects of medieval life.
Yes, and just like then, those who are doing that are saying that God is on their side in doing so.
Right. Okay, at least one of the philosophers you cited did mention how the existence of billionaires leads to undemocratic, disproportionate power and undue influence.
Yeah.
So we can leave that where it is because we both agree with that, and that's already been stated. I guess the last thing I want to mention on my list of cons is to take issue in particular with what Schelling had to say. Aggregate patterns don't reveal motives, and accumulating wealth isn't necessarily a sign of evil intent,
Yeah.
That's the single theory you floated that I most strongly want to push back against, because I do think it's just morally repugnant in a society with such rampant inequality for a tiny few to control so much wealth. That's just, there is a moral dimension to that, and it's repugnant. And I also, this is my personal opinion, I believe that to become a billionaire in the first place, you almost have to be either a sociopath or just an asshole. Because to spend so much of your time and energy accumulating wealth and then hoarding it, shielding it, hiding it from the tax man, and hiding it from your own workers is just such a despicable behavior that it's hard for me to even conceive of billionaires being good people. And so I take issue with what Schelling said. I believe these aggregate patterns of billionaires do reveal their motives, and they're not laudatory.
Yeah, I think that's probably true of many of them. I will speak up in defense of Warren Buffett. He does seem to be a decent guy at the very least, and possibly a good one. to the extent that I know him, which is not great. I think the standards that a couple of the philosophers set, which is that a fortune is just if it was gained through just means, I think probably the world of business is a bit too messy for that. Like there's no one who's going to rise that high with his hands completely clean. Certainly Bill Gates was a ruthless businessman when he was running Microsoft. Like he took no prisoners, and that was a significant part of why he became so wealthy.
Right.
I do think, though, that for some, when you get that high, I don't think it's about the money anymore. I think it has become a game for them. They do it because that's what they do. And the money comes in the process, and they don't really think about it that much. There's actually a famous Bill Gates quote, like having $1 billion doesn't make a cheeseburger taste any better. The cheeseburger costs what it costs, whether you have $100 or $1 billion, and getting to $1 billion doesn't make anything better. And I think behind that is his learning at some point where in his mind, maybe $1 billion meant a lot. And when he got there, it didn't actually make any difference to him because he wasn't focused on making the $1 billion. He was focused on playing this game, which was running his business and competing against the other companies and winning in that competition. I think that's what motivated him. And I think that was at his heart, basically an amoral goal. It wasn't something that he was thinking, am I doing the right thing? I don't think that even crossed his mind. And that can serve as an indictment, or it can serve as an acquittal, depending on your perspective, of people who single-mindedly pursue a goal. And I think probably that describes most, if not all, billionaires.
Okay, and just for the record, I will say that it's probably true that none of us has clean hands, or very few of us. Like, for example, I have no idea how my retirement investments are being invested. For all I know, they're invested in sweatshops in Southeast Asia. And yet I'm not spending my entire life zealously trying to make money as the end all and be all of my life, as so many of these billionaires do.
Right.
So I really think there's a moral difference there. So I don't want to do short shrift to the arguments in favor of billionaires, not all of which I heard in the defense statements by the philosophers. So I'm willing to concede that the capitalist system that we live in the United States provides incentives for risk taking and for the development of entrepreneurs and innovation. And you know, that wealth creation through risk taking and innovation leads to job creation. So even though I don't believe in trickle down economics, I concede that some of the wealth does actually trickle down. And if you create a climate that incentivizes people to take risks, you're going to do a lot of great things.
Yeah, I think that's true. I brought up that point a little bit earlier, and this is consonant with that wealth insulates you against risk. Great wealth allows you to take big chances. The way where someone like you and I, we would have to really be absolutely certain that something would succeed before we invested our life savings in it. It's just much easier for someone who has hundreds of millions or even $1 billion to take a risk because they know that they can come back from it. So yes, I do think that it opens up possibilities that that perfect egalitarianism does not.
Yeah, although I will note that, you know, there's one of the arguments on the right is that you need to have unfettered capitalism in a place like the U.S. because in highly taxed, highly regulated societies, you don't encourage that kind of innovation. That's not entirely true. You know, there are countries like in Scandinavia, for example, where they have very high tax rates and a lot of regulation, but they're also very innovation friendly. And the reason they are is because they invest all those taxes in doing the things I was saying earlier, you know, offering free higher education to all their budding millionaires, free healthcare, robust research and development, you know, just a better social safety net for everybody. And that also encourages innovation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is something I wish we did more of in the United States.
Yeah. Just as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking that if by some political quirk we do get back to the 90% tax bracket, it would be cool if that funded like a safety net for people who do take the big swings, so that innovation could come from someone whose father did not go to Harvard. Innovation could come from someone who maybe didn't even finish college but has the powerful idea. Because I have to believe that great ideas are there, but the money's not there, and so the innovation isn't there. Fingers crossed that I live long enough to see a society like that.
Right. Yeah, and I just wanted to concede one other thing, which is that, wealth is not a zero-sum game. It's not true that every dollar in wealth you create is a dollar taken out of the mouths of starving young babes, there's actually, just like that money multiplier I was mentioning earlier, innovation makes the pie bigger, remember that George W. Bush malapropism where he said
higher.
We need to make the pie higher.
Yeah.
But what he meant is that capitalism and innovation and wealth creation makes the pie larger. And there's truth to that. We need to be clear-eyed about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Silicon Valley is a great innovation success story, and to a large extent, it was driven by surplus capital that people were willing to invest in possibly world-changing ideas. And in the right conditions, that can produce enormously successful companies that employ tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. And so, there is a success scenario within that. And it's not just billionaires building yachts for themselves.
All right. Well, thank you for a good conversation.
Sure. Yeah. I don't think I changed your mind, but I do think that there are ideas here on which intelligent people can disagree.
Yes, I agree with that. All right. Well, give me your question for next time.
Okay. So I came across a headline in Wired the other day. Dimming the sun would lower the risk of El Nino. That article reminded me of a topic I've wanted to ask about for a while now, which is geoengineering. We've covered climate change before, twice actually, in episodes 6 and 20. And the cost of doing nothing about it could be enormous, but I see no sign so far that people are going to give up their cars or that factories are going to stop belching pollutants. So if we're realistically not going to cut emissions enough to make a difference, and if we'd rather not perish in flood and famine, then maybe deliberately re-engineering the climate is our last, best, and possibly only hope. So here's my question. What forms of geoengineering are actually being proposed? How feasible are they? And once you've dug into the details, do you think geoengineering would do more harm than good?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Mark. That will be an enjoyable thing to research. Yeah. I've read a couple things here and there about geoengineering, but I really don't know much about it. So I'll look forward to checking that out.
Yeah.
And I will certainly get back to you and to this listening audience that's starved for further pearls of wisdom from the mansplaining team.
Yes, desperately waiting for the next episode to drop.
So you heard it, folks. That's my mission for next time. And we'll come back to you in 2 or 3 weeks with the next episode of Mansplaining. I just want to add that if you want a slightly different take on whether billionaires should exist, keep listening for the Mansplaining House Band's latest recording.
Okay, I can't wait.
That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
Billionaire die. If I offed me a billionaire, would that make me a trillionaire? If they all died tomorrow, would I feel any sorrow? Rich people are the enemy, and there's a Second Amendment remedy. If I offed me a billionaire, would that make me a trillionaire?
choice but to beat him. No need to swallow my gripe when I have a lead pipe. If I offered me a billionaire, would that make me a trillionaire? Eat the rich, says the sign. A pitchfork will do just fine. Watch me go to town, see his blood trickle down. If I offered me a billionaire, would that make me a trillionaire? Try, 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 trillionaire, try!
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.